Hello everybody folks, good morning, welcome to the intro before the intro, to the, TED Talk on Weapons for Tactics Ogre Reborn. So I wanted to cover a couple quick concepts that I noticed I could have covered a bit better in the video itself, just to help make stuff a little bit more clear here. Because you have to understand, when it comes to pretty much any Matsuno game here, a lot of these mechanics will have originally kind of come from tabletop sort of logic there. So there's going to be a lot of that sort of like picking and choosing certain mechanics to apply at certain times kind of situation. And in many cases, it can seem a little bit weird if, for example, you've seen, videos where somebody still has a pile of old weapons and you're like, dude, what are you doing? It's an RPG. Why don't, you only have your best in slot kind of a situation. And you have to understand that there really is no like best in slot thing. And I think like this right here would be a solid example. On paper, you look at these two weapons and it's like, okay, you're upgrading from 77 to 84. That is the attack value. That means weapon better, right? Well, not necessarily. And you might think, okay, wait, they're probably going to go on about the stats, right? And no, not necessarily. See, when you're looking at minimum and maximum values in old RPGs, usually they're going to be up and down in a lot of different ways. And, technically speaking, looking at these weapons, despite the fact that everything will technically be doing they won't really be random rolling more than a few points of damage, but every weapon does kind of have a minimum and maximum value that changes based entirely on context. So looking at that attack value, the way that you should be looking at it is when it comes to that attack value, that is their not low percentage, but their kind of like low hit, so to speak. So like you could see this thing as doing 77 to 6%. Instead of looking at it as just the weapon does that amount and then adds these stats on top. So, for example, both of them, for example, would be 6 weight to carry around. So that's added to their recovery time at the very start. They have a different recovery time to swing. They have exactly the same maximum value with that 6%. And then on their low value, that's going up slightly with this upgrade. But for a character that already potentially might do more with that 6% than the difference between these two weapons over here, so we're looking at a 7-point difference in attack, if a character, for example, is already swinging for more than 6%, that's going to matter a lot more on this weapon, and potentially, they might prefer the savings on time every time that they're swinging it over the slightly higher bump in minimum attack for this weapon. So early on, the technically stronger weapon might be a lot better, but later on, a character might essentially go in reverse and be like, okay, how light of a weapon can I get away with? What kind of stats can I potentially be stacking for with this particular weapon? Instead of like, oh, how do I make attack number go up? Instead, it's like, okay, I already know that I'm going to get way bigger percentages off of just, swinging on, personal element strengths and using the finishers at the right time, using a shield to just insta-kill that one guy. Essentially, you're just ignoring that minimum value, which was previously a lot more valuable when they were first starting. Hopefully that makes sense. So I just kind of wanted to explain that real quick before we actually get into the video proper, because there can be a lot more complicated considerations going into play, and many of these numbers that seem like fluff may potentially be very useful under the right circumstances. If a character wanted to, for example, stack one particular type of stat for one particular type of reason. Anyway, back to the video proper. I just wanted to kind of start off with that concept of, yes, even the early game weapons do have a lot more to them than may immediately meet the eye. And alright, enjoy the video. Thank you for stopping by. Hello folks, welcome and good morning to a guide on weapons. Alright, so how do we determine what a weapon is? How do we determine what makes a weapon good? Because I've seen a lot of videos here or there or wherever on, like, oh, these are the best categories, or these are the best weapons of every category, or that kind of thing. But coming from a guy that has spent entirely too much time on this fictional island here, I wanted to go ahead and throw a few little pointers out there to kind of understand what we're even looking for when it comes to a good weapon for a particular job. Because here's what we have to understand. These weapons are not just another thing to throw on that particular category or whatever else. Every one of them has very particular properties for very particular things, and in most cases, a bigger number isn't necessarily better. So let's kind of get into all of these, kind of go down category by category, and try to understand what it is that makes a weapon good. So we'll go ahead and start off just kind of from the very left here. We'll go ahead and start off with fists, work our way down to guns, and understand what it is that makes these categories tick. Alright, so first and foremost, let's look at the fists. So these are going to be a two-handed weapon. These are going to be taking up both hand slots. There's a few weapons that are going to be taking both slots exclusively. Those are going to be your fists, your two-handed swords, your spears, your 2 HKs, whips, this time around anyway. This was different last time. And most of the other ones have one-handed variants. So, let's kind of get into this here. So, fists are, like all weapons, going to have a variety of different versions. I want to point out that when it comes to picking particular elements, or picking, particular matches, or picking particular racial bonuses off these different weapons, no one category is going to have an exclusive monopoly on absolutely everything. Every one of them is going to have something going for them. So, just so you know, when it comes to all of these bonuses, this is something they all have, whatever you may have heard before. Alright. Let's understand our bonuses first of all. So we'll go ahead and pick any, let's go ahead and pick this one because it's got all three on hand here. So you've got three things to consider on your first baseline here. We're not even going to get into attack value yet. That is a surprisingly minuscule amount of what the weapon can do for you. But first and foremost, when it says that a weapon does a particular damage type, this is correct for you, but the way that you should be thinking about it is this gives 17% physical damage. So this is going to be 17% extra damage that this is going to be doing after the initial, stats v stats check, right? But think of that as just physical, and think of the actual damage type as your personal armor. That is going to be the armor profile that you're going to be using. Whatever your primary weapon is, that is going to be the type of personal defense that you'll be using out of your armor. Whether this was a bug or unintentional feature, who knows? But this essentially allows for this kind of situation where you're going down the list and it's like, okay, that weapon's going to be using pierce armor. So you can look at your armor and it's like, okay, 11% physical reduction right here, 9% extra over here, so we're up to 20. But we're not getting anything if we're using these gloves. So maybe we want to go over here and, we'll take, let's say, 6% extra over here. So now we're up to 26% resistance. Now we're up to 34% resistance over here. And now, this version of the ring doesn't give us very much, but we'll go ahead and say that this gives us up to, what the hell were we at? Now we're at 39% physical resistance, something like that. So, depending on your weapon type, that's one way to think about it, okay? Now, physical resistance, interestingly enough, does actually have a part to play in magical resistance as well. So this basically means, if you've ever seen spells and it says, hey, it does crushing damage, what that translates to is it is a physical damage type. And your resistance is physical. So, it'll check against physical first, and then it'll check for elemental defenses. So, right off the bat, we already know that, okay, we can use our weapon for defense. That's our first thing. Second of all, it has another bonus right here for its element. Now, this doesn't mean that it's going to be doing 16% electrical damage. Alright? This is a completely different thing. This actually has two different rules that it'll end up following. If you are personally lightning, like for example this guy right here is personally lightning, if he were to use this weapon, he would get a 10% bonus when attacking with it. But what's that 16%, I hear you ask? Well, if he weren't to rely on his personal bonus, that bonus would kick in instead. So for example, if he is attacking a water unit, he would personally be doing 10% extra, but he would already be taking advantage of the 30% bonus provided by the element in order to hit that unit. But let's say he was fire. Actually, and for the sake of this example, we'll say he's ice, because the water, fire, there's more to that equation. But instead, it would look at the weapon, and it's like, oh, the weapon itself is strong against that unit, so okay, here, take an extra 16% damage because of this lightning. This is why all of your relic weapons can upgrade their percentages, but they can't upgrade their stats. The stats are always going to be a set thing. And then lastly, you have your racial bonuses, which is where some of your wackiest bonuses come from. So for example, if this weapon were to be used to punch a water dragon, that thing would probably just die. It's one of those kinds of situations. The end game is not about the stats. The end game is about the multiplication bonuses. And these are those cases where a weapon's going to go completely wacky, because essentially it would be taking that advantage of attacking on an element, and then it would also take the advantage of attacking with a bonus that's attacking the racial type of that unit. So anyway, you have that over there, and every weapon category will have different flavors of those kinds of interactions, like I said. Additionally, though, those are only for, regular attacks. But there are additional versions as well, and those are going to be the debuff weapons. So every category will have a few of these, like, for example, the claws here will have the poison cat claws and the poison tiger claws, as well as Damask, which in every category will provide a stun effect. Alright? So these are going to be cases where a weapon will have a set effect to potentially trigger when taking a swing. If you have anything that says 100% in the description, this effect will be guaranteed. Otherwise, it's typically somewhere in the 15 to 30% ballpark as far as whether that effect will land. Now, by default, every category will have, generally speaking, 2 to 4 weapons that will give a debuff of some kind. And then later on, you'll see averse versions. Now, averse weapons are typically something that's going to be working a lot better in unison with something else. So, for example, a warrior running double strike will get a lot more benefit out of an averse weapon, because this means that that secondary hit will do, I think it's like 15 to 20% extra damage because of that averse effect on there. It basically means that any incoming damage from that type will do dramatically more. So, for example, something like these fire claws, or these dragon blades over here, the way that you can look at it is, okay, it's able to punish ice units, because it's a fire weapon. It's able to punish dragons, because it's an anti-dragon weapon. It's got a decent attack score, which, when it comes to attack score, bear in mind that pretty much any weapon aside from maybe the first couple tiers at the very top that you start with are going to be just fine. The actual attack score is not what you should be focusing on at any point, because this is your lowest baseline value when you're going and hitting something. This is a value that mattered a lot more in the PSP version, because armor was a lot more tightly controlled there, and getting past a defensive value meant that you got your breakthrough from just going and punching through their defense, right? This is why, for example, ranking up skills in that version meant that you could suddenly see your numbers going completely wacky because you broke through their defenses. In this version, the way that you break through defenses is taking advantage of your elemental bonuses and your debuffs. For example, again, if he were a personally lightning unit, if he were to attack a water unit, he would be essentially getting a massive multiplier to his attack, 30% in that case, unless it was resisted by something else. And then, essentially, that would give him a bonus. If that wasn't enough, he could breach for an additional 50%. He could inflict fear to reduce that damage by 50, or he could reduce their defenses by 15%. And just to be clear, it is 15% for fear, 50% for breach. And then on top of that, you have prevailing element, which is just kind of elemental stuff in the background. Basically, if an element is used repeatedly, like whether you're using a finisher of a particular element, if you're using spells of a particular element, all of that stuff will keep stacking up and getting stronger in the background while making the opposing element weaker. You generally won't see as much of that, but sometimes you will see very wacky numbers out of nowhere. That very well could be why. And then on top of that, you have things like a verse, you have just additional, just kind of very situational stuff that we're not even going to get into at this point. But just so you know, there's a lot of things that you can stack up. All of that stacking that you did in the stat sheet back in the PSP version, you do out on the field in this version. So anyway, carrying on here, again, so we see that attack score, and generally speaking, again, most of the weapons in your category are going to be viable. You can use early game weapons straight into the end of Coda 4, and you'll be doing just fine if you have some other reason for using them. So anyway, from there, you have certain weapons that are going to be giving you additional spell slots on there. Now, these are not going to be doing very much on their own unless you're matching them. These kinds of weapons are the one case where you do want to be matching the weapon specifically, because, again, spells take their 30% bonus up front from the person using it, rather than taking it 30% from the target that they're hitting, alright? Now, usually you don't want to build your entire character around one cast of Spark Spear 3, so realistically, in most cases, this is more for those situations where, you're trotting along, you're going to your next target, you're getting into a defensible position or something, and you see, okay, there's a guy over there next to a cliff, pew, and he's gone, lucky crit, knocked off a cliff, what have you. Every attack has a roughly, I think it's 25% chance to knock back, so those are pretty decent odds for an insta-kill, but anyway, let's carry on. One more thing to note for every weapon category is the dragon item. Pretty much every category will have a dragon item, in this case dragon claws and dragon blades. Equipping 3 dragon items at the same time, whatever they are. Bear in mind for armor slots, this would be like the worm scale helm, the worm scale armor, the worm scale sleeves, or the spark guard boots. Equipping 3 pieces will give you Dragon Slayer in your skill slots. So you just basically, like let's say we go over here, we put on Dragon Claws, we go over here, we put on some Dragon Armor, some Worm Scale right here, we put on Spark Guards just to show this, and then we go over here to his skills, and I guess he's Lord, so this would have showed him anyway. But then we go over to Dragon Slayer, and it would be over there. And actually, just for the sake of showing this, we'll go ahead and switch him over to Buccaneer real quick, just to show that that would still remain there, because I believe Buccaneer, can still use all of those same pieces of equipment, so that would stay over there. But any class practically can do this. The Worm Scale set is very open, considering that everybody can equip Spark Guard boots, so whether you're operating through shields, through weapons, whatever else, there's a pretty good chance you'll be able to equip something like that. Alright. So let's go ahead and put him back to Lord here and continue on through our weapons here. So when it comes to fists, the finishers in this particular case are going to look a little bit like this. Now there's 4 categories of finishers in my mind. These are going to be the Elemental Punish, the Debuff, the Multi-Hit, and then the Neutral. So the neutrals will vary in terms of what they do. Usually like something like a neutral scaler is what I would consider something like Armageddon or Overwhelm, where it's just going to do a whole lot using your personal element. But we'll do more on these as we carry on. So to start off, just understand that finishers will operate basically like just a physical action, but it'll always give you its full bonus. So for example, right here, this unit is lightning, but he's going in and he's attacking an ice unit. Flaming Fists will give him the full 30% bonus as if he was fire, because it is a fire finisher. Alright, so next are going to be the debuff variants, so that's going to be like this right here. So that's going to go ahead and have a chance to stun. Now, the debuff variants will vary in terms of how likely their particular debuffs are to land. These are going to be all over the place. I feel like this one is particularly likely. I would say, if I were to guess, I would say probably in the 60% ballpark. Just know that these are not always guaranteed, and you are going to be using your personal element for attacking with them. Next is going to be Howling Rage. Now, these could be a neutral that could be considered its own category, because Howling Rage right here is going to be a ranged neutral attack move, and many finishers will have a ranged option to kind of help deal with some of their other range limitations. For example, with the fists, they're primarily expected to be on a unit that's just sprinting full ahead into the other guy, and generally something like Howling Rage will give them access to those kind of awkward diagonals to be able to swing out in cases where they wouldn't otherwise be able to reach their target. Bear in mind, regardless of what you may have heard over, you constantly have to be attacking a mile away in the end game. This isn't really necessarily true. I mean, I've been using melee units straight into Coda 4. It's really just a matter of personal preference. Realistically, that ranged advantage is usually going to last you maybe one turn, and if you don't have some sort of answer to units up close, well, best of luck to you. Anyway, moving on, we have Retribution for their final one here. This is going to be a slightly shorter range light punish. Pretty self-explanatory right here. And a note on finishers, just so you know, if you look at the recovery time bonus, in many cases you'll notice that actually using the finisher is actually going to be faster than swinging the weapon itself. So just so you're aware, you can very slightly modify your time to be faster or slower depending on how you want your turns to land. If you were to, for example, use a quick finisher, even in a potentially suboptimal situation, in order to maybe speed up and, save yourself a little bit of time later. Maybe you're trying to get to somebody just on time and you want to take the fastest swing possible. It might be worth going for one of your cheaper finishers. Just so you're aware, that is an option. Alright, next up, we'll be going over to daggers. So these are going to stick out in terms of being both lightweight as well as being one-handed, as well as having a lot of secondary options when it comes to their other later weapon types. So, first of all, I want to point out the basic sticker, not the upgraded one. I feel like the upgrade is directly a downgrade. But when it comes to the basic sticker, this is the lightest weight weapon in the game. Comes with a parry effect on there, gives you access to the full suite of finishers, which means that for a lot of caster types, this is a fantastic offhand weapon to have on hand. Because bear in mind, the difference between, the very basic starting dagger and something like, let's say, an upgraded assassin blade over here at the very bottom, is going to be roughly 90 attack. So you can think about that as roughly being 90 damage, which, if you think about it, when you're towards the end of the game, what's going to matter more? Whether your dagger can ideally do about 90 extra damage when swinging for a basic swing, or whether you can potentially save a decent bit of recovery time for each action, have a cheap offhand thing, and still have access to a lot of these finishers a decent bit sooner. It's just something to bear in mind. Again, this doesn't mean that this is necessarily always going to be a better situation. Just know that when it comes to one thing or another, you can, in pretty good faith, make a decent argument for a lot of weapons on this list for different circumstances. Like, for example, something like the Dark +1 is a pretty fantastic offhand weapon. Why? That's 11% bonus when going and taking a swing against something like a Griffin or a Cockatrice or something like that, which casters are very likely to run into. Or, for example, if they're having an issue with, let's say, a Cyclops or something and it happens to go nearby them, has a chance to inflict silence. Again, 11% bonus in that particular situation, still giving them that benefit of having a parry, which in the argument of a parry versus a shield will typically give you better elemental resistances, which most caster types will already have a pretty good handle on, whereas a parry will give them a far better answer when it comes to incoming arrows. And while it may not be exactly guaranteed all of the time, it's essentially both an offensive and defensive option, while saving themselves a decent bit of weight. As a little bit of a reminder, when it comes to the shields, typically these are going to weigh about twice as much. But again, use your own judgment in terms of what you think is more appropriate for your situation. Just for the sake of comparison here, something like a Balder Shield will give you a 18% bump in your damage threshold. At the same time, it'll be going and increasing your resistances by something like this. So if you are using a slashing weapon, that's going to be 6% extra physical resistances, 3% roughly elemental resistances, which I actually believe may trigger a bit earlier. I have noticed certain circumstances where, for example, when I was doing the AI run, something like a Balder Shield was enough to dissuade the AI from attacking, and really, this is really one of those cases where if you feel like you're just on the cusp of maybe preventing the AI from attacking a particular unit in a particular situation, that's when you would want your shield, but for most other general purpose situations, you may prefer something like a dagger. Alright, so when it comes to debuff variants on these, again, you have the silence effect on the Dirk +1, you have your stun effect on the Damascus, as you do. You've got your standard suite of averse weapons later on, as well as poison on the Dragon Fang. Bear in mind that the Dragon Fang is craftable, so this is one of those weapon types that really benefits from having a lot of elemental craft options available right out of the elemental temples. And additionally, their kind of bread and butter anti-dragon weapon in the form of the dagger is going to be one of the higher bonuses when it comes to all of this stuff as well, on top of giving any casters an additional cast of Poison Cloud, which can matter quite a bit if they're running concentration. So either way, lightweight, very good defensive weapon, very good offhand weapon, gives you access to a good suite of additional options. Because even if you're running something like summons in the endgame, there are certain situations where you do want to have access to switch to some kind of other damage types. Like, for example, typically something like an Overwhelm could potentially go and finish off a unit that you're not entirely sure a summon might be able to finish off. Something like a Heart Crusher against an Earth unit might do the same. Something like a shadow pin might be a lot more useful if, for example, there's a high health unit that you're not sure you'd be able to deal with. You'd be able to simply get them to stop and wait for somebody else to potentially come support as well. Double Fang might be more useful in the case of something like a crit, though in the case of casters this would be a bit less useful, since they already have a good crit abuser through their summons. However, this is going to be potentially very useful in the hands of something like a warrior there, giving them access to a decent way of multiplying their damage, especially again for warriors and berserkers and things like that. So anyway, let's go ahead and move on here to the swords. So that'll be right over here. Let's go ahead and switch over back to you. Now, when it comes to the swords, actually, one last note on the daggers. In terms of their long-range options, they actually have a pretty good selection when it comes to long-range spell lists here. Again, multiple Tornado 2s, multiple Meteor Strikes. Something like Pinion Blade I personally find especially useful on something like a Fairy. And another kind of universal note to mention here is that when it comes to relic weapons, this technically applies to other weapons as well, but relic weapons get the full effect of this. If you are using a one-handed weapon for the purposes of spellcasting, like if it is in your primary hand there, if the weapon is able to provide a bonus, you're going to potentially be applying that weapon's bonus in the case of a spell, for example, like let's say you're in that odd, awkward situation where you just got your first, let's say summon 2 or something like that, right? You want to use it, you haven't quite found the other ones just yet. In this case, he already has that one. What do I have the extra 2 of? So, like, let's say right here, he were to be a lightning element. I didn't want to switch him out of that element, but I wanted to use an off-element spell. Well, if he were to potentially switch over to a fire weapon, let's kind of give him that potential bonus right here. It would still apply 23% of that bonus in this particular case if he were to attack a ice unit. So, just, again, very oddly specific, but this is something that you see come up as a nice little benefit of potentially allowing for a kind of multi-element Valkyrie, as it were. But just something that you should be aware of as far as having a feature of that weapon. Alright, so next up, let's talk about swords. We're going to start off with their finishers right away, because this is one of the better kind of defensive loadouts. So Rendingale, just starting off with the usual crit abuser right away. The Vile Wound over here, this is going to have a very high chance, I want to say it feels like in the 60 to 70% range of applying poison. So this means that for more defensive units, or for slower units, this can be very handy for just attacking a unit multiple times while they're taking their slow recovery, as it were. Especially handy for stuff like knights. They're busy, guarding a doorway or whatever else anyway, so they might as well poison some things, allow them to potentially stack up some pretty decent numbers while effectively just standing still. You have something like Cherry Ronde, which is going to be an elemental punish, but it is in an AoE. And an interesting note on anything that is a self-target AoE is that it doesn't actually check elevation. So in the case of Cherry Ronde, if you have a unit that's, for example, like, let's say in Palace of the Dead, you have a unit that's gone up to one of those really high edges, and you can't quite reach it with your missile units, you don't have any kind of overheads available, you're like, crap, I gotta wait for them to come and, settle down somewhere? No, you don't. Walk right up to that edge, hit Cherry Ronde on that wall, and you'll hit them right on top of it. So just something that's particularly handy for a very oddly specific purpose. Again, very notable because it is an ice element, and this oftentimes happens with things like griffins, so just, that's an option. And then you have Papillon Reel for having your standard dark punish, though it is a bit on the expensive side. Though, in the hands of something like a Valkyrie, honestly, these costs are just, you might as well just count everything as free. Most of the time, they're overflowing with MP anyway. Alright. So in terms of their weapon options, they're interesting. They're actually one of those weapons that was very handy for the speedrun because of this False Strike debuff that they get on a couple of them. Particularly something like the Rapier, which you get on hand very early. Actually, their bonuses are going to be pretty reliable for this kind of weapon. As you may notice, the actual physical bonuses don't go up by too crazy of a degree, and really those are the primary damage sources here. So, like, you get 9% here, but you get 6% by the time you get the Rapier, that kind of stuff. Anyway, so as far as having a False Strike, it may seem a little bit strange to, praise an early game weapon with an oddly specific debuff. But remember that elemental counter bows, the one-handed light bows that you can make later on. They have a counterattack effect built in, and this applies to whatever other weapons you happen to be carrying. So, for example, something like a rapier, it's going to be pretty handy early on, just kind of applying that debuff, keeping your team from needing to heal in general. But this actually holds up later in the game as well, just due to the fact that it's going to be lighter weight than many of your later weapons. One-handed swords do have a tendency to get fairly hefty, but something like the rapier is fairly light on weight, and is a fantastic offhand counter weapon. Well, that is to say, it's more like you'd carry it in your primary, you'd carry your counter in your offhand, which causes you to use your primary as your counter. You get the gist. You counter with false strike, which basically means that it's like like something like the ninja's smoke bomb there, but it's going to constantly be in effect. And this can be very handy, especially in boss-related maps. Because that 20% doesn't sound like much until you see multiple finishers miss. So either way, it's a useful tool for those particular situations. It's a very great defensive weapon. Again, very early on, but it is a debuff that's very handy to just kind of have in your back pocket. It's one of those tools to pull out when you really need to, Alright, moving on, we get, your usual stun weapon kind of over here. And again, for context, I want to point out that while the differences may vary, compare the actual effective differences between these two weapons. Between the two of them, 62 attack up to 92 attack. Early on, that 30 difference will matter. Early on in the game, that'll be the stat that you worry about. Because that 30 damage will matter when you're only doing, 20-30 with your hits, but later on, that, the difference between 6% and 8% will be the far bigger difference. However, you might be able to tailor your armor for Pierce a lot better than Slash, and you might be able to deal a lot more with False Strike than you would with something like Stun. But again, it depends. Both are fairly dependable weapons, both are fairly dependable debuffs. It all depends on the type of unit that you want to build, but these are just the tools that you'd have on hand. Alright, next, swords have some of the better suites of, everything when it comes to all of your tools at the very end here. You've got a lot of missile abilities, you've got Exorcism off the Erasean, you've got Resurrect off the Brynhildr. The Brynhildr 2, I believe, has 3 Resurrects, if I'm not mistaken. The Fafnir has WAP on there, while also being an amazing anti-dragon weapon. In fact, Erasean and Fafnir on a dual-wield build is pretty wacky, because in a lot of cases, whether a unit is strong or weak, to light or dark, can essentially apply both bonuses at the same time, or something along those lines. Light and dark have a tendency to function a little bit funky, but anyway, just go with it. Odiferous Waster, terrible weapon, fantastic defensive tool. Again, it's only doing 3 blunt damage, or 3% blunt damage over there. Its actual bonus is pretty trash, but it's got a high parry rate, and it can kind of tune you into the Stinky set. So Stinky set is Odiferous Waster, the Reeking Armor, the Glistening Helm, and the Reeking Gloves. So those are wait, it was something gauntlets. I think it was Reeking Gauntlets, whatever. Where are they? Where are the stanky gauntlets? Musty gauntlets, there we go. But basically the thing makes you stink so bad that you are no longer able to be targeted by the enemy. Bear in mind, though, that your allies still hate you, so you'll constantly get hit by friendly target from or friendly fire from AoEs. It's a weird set, just roll with it. Anyway, but yeah, they have a lot of different elemental counters towards the end of the game, as well as the kind of mid-game craftables. So whether you have your lightning, your ice over here, your fire over here. Fandango's a fun reference to the Vagrant story, by the way. If you have never happened to catch that, yeah, it's a sword again that's used a lot against ghosts. It's the sword that Ashley starts with in that game. Anyway, so moving right along here, bear in mind that the Lombardia is actually going to be your first kind of knight sword, as it were, having a counter-attack on here. And then later on, you can get stuff like the Ambitian and the Brynhildr 2. But yeah, I didn't bother to get those on this particular save file. As far as ranged attacks, typically one-tile range is one of those things that's kind of kind of downplayed, or not downplayed, but put down when it comes to one-handed swords. Just bear in mind, again, they do have missile options on their stuff right here. They do have additional spell options. 2 swords, due to this particular reason, isn't even a bad idea. For a while, I had like a Dark Buccaneer Canopus running around with 2 Fafners, and basically he spent the first few rounds just shooting stuff with Wops until landing and going for finishers and stuff like that. So, again, there's a lot of options to consider. Just basic attack is far from the main thing on the list. Alright, let's move on to the next one, which is going to be two-handed swords. And these are going to be a very interesting category. So, these are actually expanded a little bit from last time. So, two-handed swords used to be kind of the butt of many jokes back in the PSP version, because they were, well, they were one tile. They had a tendency to scale real low, but this time around, their scaling has improved. Their numbers have improved across the board. Their access has improved, and additionally, their finishers have improved as well. Although, funnily enough, they kind of double up on one of them for some reason, but let's carry on here. So you have Sonic Blade, which is a nice March of the Black Queen reference. This one is going to be the fastest move that you can do with any two-hander. Even the lightest two-hander over here is going to take 28 RT to swing. This is almost twice that, so it's just here for being fast. Lightning Strike is here as a fairly standard water punish. Anyway, so Cyclone Saber has been improved this time around, being upped to 2 to 3 range. It is a fantastic long-range slapper. Again, gives them access to awkward diagonals and things like that. And it's basically going to be a near insta-kill on Earth units. Very great numbers off of this one, pretty much regardless of whatever sword you're using it on. And then lastly, you have Grand Cross, which is just that water unit I wanted deleted. It's just a straight upgrade to the previous version. I'm not really sure like why they decided, power and then more power as far as that one went, but they really wanted lightning on these swords. So as far as two-handers go, you're going to see pretty reliable slaps out of these from the very start. Just like the one-handed swords here, they're going to be starting off with some pretty good bonuses. So for example, while the one-handed swords start off at about 4% bonus, these start off at 6, and then these will end up going up pretty darn high, up to the 60s, like many of the other elemental weapons do. But in terms of their debuffs, they've got some of the best debuff synergy of all categories. But again, this will vary. So something I want to point out is Zweihander +1, which, by the way, I apologize for all the folks that got upset that I always pronounce it as Zweihander instead of Zweihander. It's always been weird for me to say Zwei. I don't know why. Like, even when we were singing in German in the old opera house and stuff like that, like, I could never pronounce German words right. For some reason, it just didn't quite click. Anyway, so Zweihander +1, generally speaking, going to be a decent. It's a funny comparison between these two, because Y +1 technically does 11% versus undead stuff. Gives you a Crush variant, which is going to give you pretty decent armor options, but both of them are going to inflict breach on hit, right? However, the actual difference between them is only about 20-ish damage, and it's really questionable whether that 1% physical bonus at the cost of 5% phantom bonus, while at the same time also losing on that strength and vitality, is actually an upgrade with the Claymore and not a downgrade. The only downside is that you lose a bit of mind, which doesn't matter, and then you get faster swing speed on the regular Y. I personally think this is one of those cases where you're kind of downgrading by upgrading in many cases. The main thing that you actually increase is 25% counter damage between the two. So again, this is not a straight line. There's always more factors to consider. But again, in terms of the actual bonuses that you're getting, if you have better access to slash armor at the time, Claymore will probably do better for you. If you prefer to use your anti-crush armor, and you are potentially facing more undead stuff, or you just want a faster version of the same breaching sword, then you stick with this Y. The rest of these, again, will have their own little kind of upgrades here or there. I'm not really going to go into some of the very specific stuff, like realistically, something like the Falx or the Boulder or stuff like that. Like, technically, Boulder, everything in the Balder category is going to be a little bit better for something like a Dark Knight or anybody that has spell slots on them in some way or another. Or, for example, something like the Broadsword is going to have a better overall strength bonus for whatever you'd prefer that give you. Like the Viking Sword is technically your first switch into Pierce armor for these types of weapons here. So, again, it depends. There's a lot of very oddly specific things to consider. Anyway, so you have your standard stun weapon in the form of the Damask, and then you start getting into the elemental options, which again, this category is just swimming in. They've got a lot of missile abilities coming off of their earlier swords, and then you have stuff like the Avalanche over here coming off the Moonblade. Typically, you're going to see good, reliable smacks coming out of all of these different weapons. Grass Hewer in particular sticks out as a nice way to kind of have an ice unit going and doing particularly good damage to stuff like beasts, while also doubling up as a great, it's a great anti-griffin weapon, while also having great synergy as an anti-octopus weapon. So just kind of something to bear in mind there. And all of them are going to remain fairly similar in terms of weight, speed, all of that kind of thing. They are, again, very close to each other. Something like the Headsman is actually going to be particularly handy versus bosses due to that 5% anatomy bonus on there. But again, lots of really big bonuses on a lot of these weapons. And just know that when you get to these like relic god weapons and things like that, a lot of those stats, they look very fancy, but in most cases they apply, you're going to get more use out of them in a defensive sense than you will offensively. Like, for example, as you see right there, the actual predicted damage difference between the lowest form of two-hander, actually technically it can go one lower, oh wait, that's just a mask, okay, whatever. Between the crappiest sword and by tiers alone, the highest version is 200 per swing for an entire game's worth of progress. But the actual bonus, the actual difference there is going to be that 8% physical bonus, that 15% water bonus. Those stats are going to, again, matter defensively. Something like those weapon skills might matter a lot if the user is, for example, a shot slinger. That's going to scale really well off that weapon skill. But you're typically going to see a lot more reliability when it comes to landing debuffs and things with a unit like this because of that mind bonus. Or, for example, you might see a bit extra off of something like those dex and strength bonuses. But again, you'll mostly see a defensive difference more so than an offensive one. However, that extra 100 health is pretty handy. What on earth is playing in the back? No idea how long that was playing. Some random ad decided to pop up in the background. Anyway, so moving right along here. Again, I just want to be super clear that when it comes to these hyper endgame weapons, a lot of the time, a lot of these numbers are just for fluff. It's really not going to be the biggest deal in the world, again, Ultimate Knight Commander weapon difference between, this other weapon is practically nothing. Really, again, unless something's throwing damage digits into the hundreds by this point, it's not going to make too much of a difference. And I know personally, going into Coda 4, I've always found a lot more use out of something like the debuff weapons than going for the ones with, bigger particular stats. Because, simply put, it's not going to be a big enough number to make a difference. The multipliers on a weapon, yeah, absolutely. For example, something like the Balmung here, that 20% extra versus dragons is going to matter a ton if there's dragons on the map. If, for example, there's phantom units, something like the Durandal will be able to carve right through that. If there's going to be angels, something like the Notos is going to be great for going through stuff like San Bronza. So, just, again, bear that in mind. And, again, this came about in practice, too. I had Canopus running the Notos for quite a while, going through San Bronza there, for this exact reason. Because, yeah, sure, the elements may only apply sometimes, but he's effectively switching to a dual element setup right here, where he's going to be personally good versus fire. His weapon is going to counter earth. He's additionally got a ranged earth counter through his finishers. He's got 2 counters versus water. And additionally, if he runs into divine units, he's got a solid answer for those too. So a lot of his puzzle pieces are there. He's got a lot of tools in his belt for countering multiple different types of units. We're not even worrying about the actual neutral effect of a lot of this stuff, because everyone's neutral damage is roughly going to be in the same ballpark, unless a multiplier is applied. Alright, so let's move on to the next one here. Alright, next we got axes. This is going to be the first of the categories with multiple hand variants. So you've got the one-handed parry variant, the two-handed counterattack variant. Going into their finishers, they start off with a solid wind punish through Ice Prison. They start off with Mistral Edge over here to inflict silence. They have Mantis Strike to take advantage of crit builds, and they've got Infinity to punish lightning, though this one also scales particularly high, and it definitely has the MP cost to show for it. When it comes to the different weapon types here, this actually, one quick note on the finishers. It's notable that since axes are a decent bit lighter than hammers earlier on, you're typically going to be able to spam a lot of things like Ice Prison here, particularly well for solo runs. So if that's the kind of thing that you're looking for, Ice Prison in particular is a solid damage, quickly spammable finisher. That may potentially overwhelm a lot of healing early on. I know this is kind of a niche application, but I'm just throwing this out there in case you're potentially stuck in that particular puzzle. Okay. So, moving on, axes tend to have a lot of vitality bonuses associated with them early on. This has a tendency to fall off for more offensive bonuses later on, though again, by that point, they also stop mattering to a decent degree. Debuff weapon-wise, they have access to misstep for whatever reason. This is actually just a holdover from PSP. Basically, misstep used to matter a decent bit more. If you happen to be on something like a Varden back in the PSP version, their accuracy was a bit worse than maybe something like an Archer. So this tended to lead to a situation where maybe inflicting misstep might be a bit more useful on them. Misstep has any additional benefits that we have not yet discovered. Generally speaking, this won't be something that you're going to see a whole lot of use out of. So these are more of a direct hitting kind of weapon. Damask once again coming in with the stun, and then from there you have the Dragon Axe and the Terror Axe with the anti-dragon bonuses for your dragon set. You've got the procs coming in for your anti-phantom bonuses. Again, with the Boreas being good for clearing stuff like Sand Bronza. You have the Shaitan's Pelova, which hates fairies, which just kind of cracks me up. Alright, next, a funny one to note here is going to be the Rune Axe, because this is actually a fantastic weapon for Kashua later on. Because that's going to be a pretty noticeably hefty mind bonus for the Princess class there, and because it's a one-handed casting weapon, if you are running a kind of closer range variant of her class there, this can mean that she can potentially multi-element using off-element spells as well. Not to mention coming in with Aqua Blast 3, which basically means that it'll automatically boost its own spells in the right circumstances. I just personally find it a little bit fun, but yeah, personally I think it's probably the weapon that I give to Kashua the most. Next up, in terms of their fancy Heaven General weapons right here, I mean, it's a pretty standard thing, as you'd expect. Big bonuses, big numbers, big flashy, ooh look, ooga booga, it does so much. For comparison's sake, because this is now just a fun comparison to me, difference between a one-handed, hand axe and the ultimate two-handed variant here is about 260 damage. So, yeah, it's all well and fancy, though realistically, technically, it looks like the Shaitan's Belova in this case would be about a 300 difference, though it is notable that the Shuprakar or whatever is almost completely unupgraded here. I just never bothered to go through all that nonsense, but anyway, let's move on. Next up, we will be discussing spears, my personal favorite. So, spears are going to have multiple different variants, however, they're not going to be hand variants. So spears are going to switch between the 1 to 2 spear version and the 2 to 3 pike version. So the spear version, despite both of them having counterattack, personally, I believe the pike variants should have had parry on there, but whatever, doesn't really matter. But yeah, the 2 to 3 variants are better for going and kind of reaching out and attacking in those situations that you otherwise might not be able to. That's actually particularly useful in the case of something like a Lord unit, going and making use of something like Double Strike to go and inflict a bunch of craziness. But again, it all just kind of depends on what you're looking for. It is notable that spears have a pretty wide access to a lot of debuff variants here. So you've got Breach coming in from the Volge. Again, still was singing this thing's praises in Dakota 4. Just something like a Terrifying Impact and Volge on Lord is just disgusting. Not to mention you can combine this with Berserk as well. So Berserk, so Breach, Fear, and yeah, hitting that in a wide arc in a complete circle. It's just disgusting. Anyway, so you're combining that. You've got stuff like the Scorpion over here for poison effect. Again, same as the stuff that I mentioned earlier. And then you also have the Damask, which, did I even bother picking up the Damask on this one? Damask comes with Stun. It sure exists. Anyway, it is, however, the first of the 2 to 3 variants, kind of limiting its application in some cases. Boy, oh boy, am I sick of being sick. Anyway, so just again to point this out with the debuff weapons, 7% plus 5%, comparing with the fancier, 6% plus 5% over here. The actual difference between them is, as always, not too massive, but elemental differences start mattering a decent bit more. The Corny Licorn, which, despite the fact it sounds hilarious, is a lot less powerful than it was in the PSP version. This used to be the first kind of light AUG weapon that you got, and it was very, very notable for suddenly allowing you to break through a lot of thresholds, but this time around it's kind of an okay anti-phantom weapon. But realistically, it's you might as well just immediately upgrade to Holy Lance. It's pretty much just a direct upgrade in all ways but weight, because it's not like you're changing anything as far as range goes. And not to mention, there's no augment difference this time around. You're just getting a direct upgrade. So either way, pretty much upgrade that as soon as you're able to. The Ignis no longer requires you to go get the Volcatus first, so that's handy. Yeah, I don't know what they were thinking with that either, because the Ignis was pretty much the most unobtainable thing in PSP, but it's a pretty standard anti-ice weapon this time around. Zephyros is one of the only Wind God weapons without a anti-angel bonus, and doesn't really have any extra spells on there or anything. It's kind of just, it is how it is. And you got the Mantisca as your anti-dragon variant. Dark Spear coming in and giving you Paralytic Wave on whoever you use it on. This can potentially be interestingly useful later on for some like kind of multi-setup builds, but overall it's not nearly as strong as it used to be. Main call for this one before used to be that it was a... main selling point for this one was that it used to give you Fear Proof, so that is kind of whatever there. And then Pavana is going to be pretty much the best for most folks. Just kind of anti-people bonus is pretty massive, just great numbers across the board. Most of the time, once you're getting into the post-game stuff, spears end up handling things particularly well, because if you are looking for something like a close-range poke on something like a Fencer, Ruination or Scythewind still have you covered at close range, whereas the actual spear itself switches to a long-range roll while Giga Tempest takes over for AoE, and then Spiral Scourge takes in for your crit multiplier, which this one's a triple instead of a double, meaning that, as an interesting thing, for all of these multi-hitters, the properties of the first hit apply to all 3 hits, meaning that if they ever do crit, all 3 are guaranteed to crit. It's one of the only times that those things happen. But yeah. Ruination is just basically going to give you a nice, solid, regular spear poke, but stronger, which again, doesn't seem like much earlier on. It's only a little bit of extra damage, but then later on you realize, okay, this just allows me to have a close-range version of my spear. Scythewind allows for a surprising amount of vertical tolerance, interestingly enough. We are primarily using this for Breach, just gives a Breach on hit. Again, a fantastic thing to always have on hand. If you are running Scorpion, this just allows you to still keep that Breach with you. Giga Tempest is just solid overall in terms of how much it can do to a group, especially good when going and applying that same bonus against water. And again, you can apply your personal bonus in many ways as well, though a lightning spear user is one of the few cases where a weapon category overall probably wants to stick to that particular element just because of how much return it can potentially give them. This is one of those few cases where that 10% can actually matter quite a bit, just due to the fact that their main synergy weapon down over here with the Pavana is going to also benefit them pretty greatly. Anyway, let's move right along here to hammers. So, notable hammers. The Caldia is very handy as an offhand thing. While its weight is 4, meaning that it's basically the same weight as a shield, it's going to be a parry variant that casters can universally carry around. It allows for clerics to take advantage of their naturally high mind scores to inflict charm, especially if they carry some spell strike powder with them. Good bonuses for resistances as well as a little bit of extra damage. Roughly speaking, this is going to be about 10 extra damage worth of intelligence. Gives you a nice luck bonus, which again is just always handy to have. And again, that parry for protecting versus arrows. The Iron Fan feels in many ways like a little bit of a downgrade, though that 5% anti-people bonus can potentially matter in some cases, as well as having a stun. In most cases, you probably won't be using the fan as much, especially given the weird access for classes that it has. But for something like the Vartan, it can be an interesting little weapon there. But again, there's just better versions of the stuff available. Anyway, as far as debuffs go, you have the Damask coming in with the stun, you've got Silence coming off of the Baldur Hammer over here, and then at that point we start getting into the other variants down in this direction. Sanguine Hammer is I believe the only craftable weapon that'll give you a Paralytic Wave on there, so just kind of a handy little extra. When it comes to the Elemental variants, again, you know, they've got a pretty wide variety of them here. Glacies is a rare case of a weapon being very clearly designed as an anti-griffin weapon. So there you go. You kind of expected to maybe have a bit more anti-griffin stuff in the description, but anyway, moving on here. As far as different spell effects on here, you got Spirit Surge off the Veritas, you got Petra Burst off the Dagda, Spark Sphere off the Flame Flail. Unfortunately, nothing off for the Aqua Hammer this time around. But yeah, overall, as far as their extra effects go, they're about as stacked as you'd expect, but not quite as stacked as some of the others. However, if we switch over to their finishers real quick, which actually I probably should have just switched to one of the spellcasters at this point, but whatever. It is what it is, but as you can see, for the purpose of the spellcasters, this allows for a wide amount of elemental access, and for especially a lot of units that happen to be over focusing on one particular element, summoners or what have you. This is going to be a very handy tool to have in your back pocket. Because, for example, if you're running into a unit that is highly resistant to your weak multi-hit move, and again, I say weak when it comes to summons because the individual attacks are weaker than your basic tier 1 missile abilities, but there's just a lot of them. Meaning that if you end up losing, let's say, half of your damage from your very first one, you are losing half that damage on every one of those hits, meaning that sometimes you want to potentially have an elemental punish instead. So, like, let's say, for example, you're going and, like, you got your fire thing, well, actually not fire, let's say they're a wind element or something, right? So we go over here, they got their Sylphide, and they target with their Sylphide, oh no, my usual, 200s are down to only 60 per hit. This is gonna do absolutely nothing, versus this particular guy. They're, like, let's say they're going and they're attacking this ice guy, and it's like, okay, they're gonna completely resist this. Instead, they reach over here, they get their Crimson Reach, and they're gonna potentially get, them and their allies for a decent bit more. So these are just handy to kind of have in your back pocket. They won't have the range of your spell options, but this can be used under the right circumstances to go for a big elemental punish in the right circumstance. So Tyrant's Mace, standard air punish. Gaia Sunder is good for inflicting weaken on something, which again is particularly good for casters who, for example, are being bullied by something that they can't quite kill yet. This just allows them to vastly reduce the damage output of that particular unit. Crimson Reach is going to give you a big AoE kind of a fire splash there, and then Dancing Sprite is going to give you a very high scaling water punish, but again, it's very expensive. So that's about that for fans. Let's move on to the Weeb Knife, the 1HK here. So these are a very hybridized weapon here. So when it comes to the 1HK, they're, in terms of their overall bonuses, as far as debuffs, they don't really have much going for them, and in many cases they're going to have a lot of very, very specific bonuses. Like, for example, something like the Wakizashi over here might be very handy to keep early on. Yes, its attack value is going to be, drastically less than some of the later variants, but that 5% will scale up a lot better than that, than that initial penetration value would lead you to believe. But again, they're generally a weapon that's going to be a bit harder to get a hold of, a bit harder to upgrade, and generally won't drop as often as some of their other ones, or some of the other variants, because there's really only one class that uses them. Though I will say, in the hands of something like a Lord unit, you'll typically get a lot more use than the ninja units there. Though I will note that if you are running a sword build, if you are just running it as a defensive offhand weapon, bear in mind that they've got a lot of spell effects on the later variants, especially something like, Deadshot 4s with a, decent pile of them. It's pretty notable. They've got some of the better spell slot, like free spell slot setups towards the very end there. And again, you have a crafted variant that's going to give you spells there as well. So it's just something that gives them a nice little range tap whenever they need it. Sometimes you just want a missile ability to go finish something off, So generally going to be just barely above the knife in terms of their parrying ability. In terms of debuffs, they don't get their first debuffs until they get down to the, was it Muzo? Yeah, Muzo is their Damask variant. Their Balder variant is the Spirit Blade. In many cases, it's actually worth carrying, if you are doing magic and swords, stick with Spirit Blades, just for the extra intelligence bonus, or just Spirit Blade and Balder's Shield is actually probably going to be the better variant for that. Just kind of maybe keep concentration instead of a second sword. It's just the swords themselves are not terribly amazing. Again, even once we're getting into kind of like middle of the road basic ninja swords here, they're still roughly equivalent to early game basic swords. Their numbers just do not really go up as high, is the thing. If they're attacking on elemental weaknesses, sure, you'll still see a decent bed here, but they're very weak by comparison. But anyway, moving right along here. Actually, it's probably more accurate to say they're weak, but they scale well. But anyhow, let's go on to their finishers real quick. So in terms of their finishers, you have a very great finisher in the form of Dark Blade here, 3 to 5 range. It's very hard to get out of range of this thing. It's got some pretty fantastic reach. So this is going to be one of the bigger selling points of the entire weapon category. Got Thunder Wave, standard 2 to 3 range water punish, Swallow Slash for going and abusing crits, and then Advent Sign for hitting dark units. But really, Dark Blade, despite being a neutral one, is going to give you a nice punish right there in the very beginning there. It's a very, very good snipe move. So just again, bear that in mind. The problem is ninjas have a very hard time generating MP. So yeah, at least not without causing a lot of harm to themselves. Moving on. Alright, when we move on to the 2HK, bear in mind that this is a support weapon for a support class. There's only 2 classes able to use this thing. As per usual, it's going to be Lord, and in this case, Swordmaster. And everything about them is entirely built for that purpose. They work for what they need to do, but they're not going to compare, like, think of them again as closer to a cudgel than a spear, for example. But let's move on here. So as far as their finishers, Skyrend is just a neutral, bigger hit. There's not really too much special about this one, though it does have, just like not Rending Gale, but just like, dang it, what's the the spear one. The spear tier 2, it has a decent bit of kind of elevation forgiveness, so that's kind of its main feature there. Stone Bloom, which is going to be a faster one. It's one of the few cases where the second one is actually faster, with a chance to petrify. The petrification feels like it's somewhere in about the 30 to 4% ballpark, but still, it's going to be a pretty reliable hit. Sun Blossom is going to be a close-range ice punish, and then Ghost Whale is going to be a close-range light punish. But again, these are just kind of extra tools. They kind of knew that you'd be doing other things with these particular units, so the finishers aren't exactly going to be the biggest deal in the world. Going down the list of different weapons here, notable is that they're only going to have access to cutting and crushed variants. There are no Pierce 2 HKs. Their later bonuses get very significant in terms of like the Ogre's Bane absolutely carving through undead units, or for example something like the Sweep Blade being exceptionally good versus bosses. Bear in mind that this is again one of those very few cases where for something like the Sweep Blade here, you actually would want to have a Dark Element Swordmaster, because this Hellhound it comes with would not get its 30% bonus otherwise. Being two-handed weapons, they don't get that spellcasting bonus, so this can lead to a lot of, if you've ever seen those posts of, oh, you know, I got the Sweep Blade, I was using a Hellhound, it does no damage, how high do I need to get my intelligence? It's not an intelligence thing, they're just not getting their 30% bonus from not being dark. Anyway, in terms of their bonuses here, their counterattack bonuses are pretty decent. Mage Blade is basically the Mage Masher from FFT, but big. Has a silence effect on hit, which they can actually guarantee this time around, so this can make them very useful for kind of breaking off from their frontline support role to go and attempt to silence a unit. This actually makes them really good as a support to frontline knights, because for example if enemy knights keep healing or something along those lines, they can just kind of go and carve their neck out, so to speak. In terms of a stun effect, again, Helmhaver is going to be pretty solid, also pretty good against golems, so that's going to be coming in with a stun effect on there, which again can be guaranteed in their hands. From there, they just have a verse variance with some spells on there. But again, a lot of them are going to have kind of specific layouts for a lot of different stats. So, for example, you're going to notice a decent bit more resistance on their weapons compared to some other ones. They're usually going to have a lot more, like vitality, avoidance, resistance, all of that kind of thing. These are usually not going to be enough to be a massive deal on their own, and you're typically going to see fairly comparable damage across all of these, so just stick to whatever very specific thing that you like. Like, they literally start off at 83, and technically they cap out at 144, but if we're talking for the basic variants, we're talking about a jump from 83 to 124. That's barely going to matter, and only a 3% difference in terms of their physical damage, right? So overall, again, their numbers don't go particularly scarily high, but they are used to counter very particular things. Normally, you won't be worrying too much about the weapon that your support carries. This is essentially the medic's SMG, more or less. Alright, next up we have the Cudgels, which despite the fact that all of their finishers are coming in as light, it's generally recommended to have them as anything but light, just simply because you'd be able to take advantage of multiple different elements. You already have light covered by literally every single thing on here. Wrathful Strike is just, standard elemental punish. Raining Blows is going to be going and attacking twice. Pressure Whirl is going to be a big AoE splash that has a chance to drop Enfeeble. This is particularly handy for casters that are just looking to set up. And then Trinity Pulse is going to be a triple hitter. Alrighty, a bit on the short side when it comes to time, but let's go ahead and wrap this up here. So yeah, when it comes to Cudgels, it's notable that they scale at 10% the normal rate of most other melee weapons. Again, every one of them will kind of scale in their own way, but we're talking as a kind of general ballpark here. They're meant to do no damage by themselves when swung as a weapon, but their finishers are a completely different story. When it comes to the weapons themselves, generally speaking, they're not used as weapons, but just like the two-handed sword, a bit more of a support tool, though in this case they're more of a very dedicated support tool. In the case of something like the Damascus Mace, the standard version that is, it's going to be generally better versus people, and in the case of something like the +1 version, it's going going to be better versus golems, though again, you realistically don't want to be using either of these as a primary weapon. It's just kind of a thing that you can have here, though the stun effect on the +1 is, you know, relatively handy in the case of something like a Berserker, though realistically you should just use a Damask Hammer for that purpose. Do you just want a stun baton? You know, maybe you're going for a pacifist setup? That certainly exists. Basically, it's weird because the previous role of the shot has been taken over by the cudgel when used as a basic weapon. It's kind of an interesting one of those shift-arounds, but more on that later. Anyway, any of the one-handed variants of the staves will give you their full effect for their element when they are strong against the unit that you're attacking here. So, for example, if this staff were to be used when attacking a lightning unit, that extra 5% would apply in the case that an off-element spell were to be used. This is a very niche application, but again, it will still technically do its job. This basically means that the Ripple's Rod is, for the most part, unequivocally the best weapon in the cudgel category, just due to the fact that the technically stronger ones over here, while giving you better stats, would not necessarily give you that bonus. So if you're looking for overall stats and things, something like the Wise Man's would be the strongest, though again, the actual difference is only going to be, as you see there, about 40 per spell cast. This can potentially matter a decent bit for, you know, something like summons if you end up rolling high. So if you're looking for something like that, that's there, but if you're looking for off elements, or if you're looking for, you know, say a racial bonus off the thing, or if you just want the luck bonus, the Ripple's Rod is, generally speaking, pound for pound going to be a bit better of a value. Or if you want the more defensive version, you could always go for the Cursed Cudgel. Realistically, you just kind of use whatever cudgel you have on hand with a +5 bonus. Most of them will come with the Charge 100 ability. This used to be exclusive to the Melitza staff, but now has just basically been copy and pasted and vomited all over the entire category. Though that being said, again, as far as wands go, generally Ripple's going to be the best for that. If you prefer to go for a staff, generally Wise Man's can see the most use out of that. And then if you just prefer to use the Sage Staff, it exists. It's right over there. Personally, I prefer something like the Staff of Purification there, which still keeps that same +5 range, but gives you Exorcism instead of a Charge 100, and then you have something like the Staff of Restoration, which, I mean, the 300 heal can maybe be handy. It's just not necessarily as applicable as some other things, but it does save you on item slots, potentially. It's also worth noting that certain things like, for example, the Mage Staff +1 can give you your +2 range a bit early if you happen to have fought some of the monster units early on in Chapter 1. Potentially you can wind up with getting the drops for this, but realistically you probably can just duck into Farampa real quick. Get access to that +2 range about a chapter early. Aside from that, not really much more to say about this category. Let's go ahead and move on. Oh, actually, you can actually counter using a cudgel. Just use an offhand counter weapon. It looks very funny. You should do it. Moving on. Alright. Next up, we have the whips. So these are basically the spear for when you don't have a spear. These things, they may not seem like much, but man, oh man, are they an absolute just god-tier weapon as far as pretty much the entire game goes. I mean, I've literally accidentally used the bullwhip +1 instead of the clear crack. Barely even noticed a difference. This whole category is just fantastic. Why? Well, like I said, just like the spear, you've got that 2-tile range, you've got decent bonuses, though not insanely high. Though that being said, something like the Spike Laurel or Clear Crack will, generally speaking, be pretty solid. But then you start getting into stuff like the Supple Whip or the Cat of Nine Tails. You're getting, 20+% physical bonuses. I mean, look at this ridiculousness. This thing's getting 34% physical bonus, on top of already good solid numbers, on top of having a massive luck bonus, on top of cursing on hit. And that's even before getting into the finishers, which are all at range. You got a Fire Punish, which is fairly rare from the Floodlash here. You got Wrenching Coil to drop a slow on somebody, a Swift Thrash for a multi-hitter, and then Armageddon is tied with Overwhelm on the daggers for having the highest neutral scaling in the entire game, essentially being 3 times your initial attack value. Now, this alone basically makes the Weecha class, because through a combination of Meditate and counterattacks, they can spam Armageddon every round. It's a very weirdly specific thing that they can do, But yeah, this thing hits everything like a truck. It barely even matters as far as element goes. You'll do better with your personal element, but yeah, this is just by default one of the highest minimum values for an attack, just full stop. But yeah, not exactly. This is like weight-wise, they're not exactly the lowest. But generally speaking, this is like a two-hander and spear hybrid, more so than any kind of a light weapon. This is definitely a heavy hitter, especially something like the supple whip. There's a reason that it's only found a couple places in Palace of the Dead. This is hands down one of the only examples of a weapon that actually is a massive game changer on its own at the time that you get it. Like, anti-people bonus is pretty notable. Most of the time it's relegated to far, more difficult to get weapons and stuff like that. Crush defense is fairly easy to come by. Just to kind of point this out right here, when it comes to crush defenses, if we're going down different armor types, like for Lord in particular here, if we're looking in terms of, what was I looking for here specifically? Like, in terms of the helmets, generally speaking, you're going to have access to 3% or higher pretty regularly. But again, combine that with something like the Skull Mask. Like right here, like 14% plus 15% plus, let's go ahead and, is this Daedalus? I mean, Daedalus is going to come with 7% and already pretty decently high, just kind of a high penetration resistance on top of this. Generally speaking, a lot of the more convenient items are going to come with crush bonuses on there. So either way, it's really nice to see. You can combine that with Earthgreaves on here. Like, when fighting people units, this guy is nigh immortal at this point. It's disgusting. Anyway, let's move on. Alright, what is there to say on books? All 9 of them have basically the same stats. Like stats, better earlier on, worse later on. Really great bonus versus the one thing that they're currently angry about. But aside from that, they lower your strength, which means higher physical incoming damage. They max out at +3 range, and they can't actually overcome that until the Grand Grimoire, which is in like very, very late Palace of the Dead, if you happen to get it at all. Finisher-wise, they come with the earliest Lightning Punish with Disembраin, Raging Pummel, which has a chance to leaden, Eviscerate, which just attacks twice, and then Devastate is going to give you a light punish. But they're going to be pretty up there in terms of MP costs. So overall, I'm not a huge fan of this category. It's just... It's neat. It's just very oddly specific. Just books themselves, you're usually not going to be attacking with the books very often. You can swap out for the thing that you're currently fighting, but again, it's just kind of weird to do. They don't get the range of some of the other options, and the fact that they give you a strength penalty is just kind of a bit of a middle finger, to be completely honest. They don't really necessarily make sense as an offhand weapon either, because their finishers are a little bit too oddly specific to work for that. You could technically combine this with something else for, something like the Lord. Immediately what's coming to mind is maybe like Sword and Book might be kind of interesting. But again, it's I would describe it as more of a gimmick weapon, more than a primary thing. Again, it gives you extra options. I just don't feel like those options are necessarily too amazing, Something like Leaden you can accomplish a lot easier with a bow, and generally speaking, cudgels will do everything that this category does, just better overall. Right, next up we got instruments, which are an interesting case where pretty much all of them are going to be used for the purpose of giving you a free spell slot. Generally speaking, being a bit of an artificer was her shtick back in the PSP version, and this time all of her instruments have been given a song in order to kind of reference that. Though interestingly enough, she comes with a Pandero and a dagger, which seems like a weird combo at first because there's like almost complete overlap between the Pandero and dagger, but Pandero and Caldia is nuts in terms of having just overall coverage for everything. Just because you have your neutrals, you have your debuffs, you got your wind AoE, you got your water AoE, you've got your ice, you've got your fire AoE, you've got your lightning, you've got your debuffs. You get full coverage using something like Instrument and Hammer, so definitely something worth considering. But realistically, if you just want free casts of one particular type of music or another, Escalating Sonnet, greatest healing move in the game, just kind of throwing that out there. You got all those out here. In terms of these spells that are here, Generally, weakening Droppo, it might work in boss scenarios, just kind of weakening them down. Taunting Mambo, unlikely that you're going to need to run into Fall Strike that often. Stirring Full Core, great for Spellcraft and just kind of spreading around free HP and MP. It's kind of generally good stuff. Sombra Kachera, Fall Strike just really never comes up. And I don't mean that in terms of it's unusual or whatever else. I just mean it literally does not have a whole lot of purpose in this game. It's just typically range attacks will always have 100% hit chance. And then Poised Arabesque is, again, just great for regeneration here. I just want to double check one thing. I believe Poised Arabesque was actually, yeah, right. Poised Arabesque is the one that's HP and MP. And then Full Core, I believe, is Healcraft and Healing, isn't it? Let me double check here. It's just Healcraft. Well, either way, Healcraft can be handy for healers and stuff like that. Generally, I would not recommend having an entire instrument for that, but Poised Arabesque or Escalating Sanet are definitely great ones to start off with, especially with the songstress potentially coming in with... where are her skills? Why are her skills not here right now? She's supposed to have the... Oh, that's because I'm in the wrong category. Okay. Echoing Voice or Resounding Voice, honestly, because the fact that she's got free songs on her instruments, she can absolutely just run without Meditate and just generate MP off of just fighting stuff physically. So just another thing to bear in mind. In many ways, she's kind of a riff on a Valkyrie in that way, where she's going to be generating MP through it, well, simply not using it. It just happens to be on her items instead. Now, Ardent Conga with Spellcraft, and I believe that's the one that gives you MP as well, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, Spellcraft and MP, so that's going to be just a great one to start off with. So either way, great kind of Artificer unit with a Songstress here. Just really would highly recommend Pandero and Caldia. It's just such good coverage. Really, the Songstress is kind of more of a brawler than it gets credit for. So anyway, let's go ahead and move on. Alright, so minor thing with blowguns, I don't have somebody to show these off right now because my main blowgun guy kind of got thrown down a hole, so that's a bit of a bummer. But anyways, you get ice, you get lightning, you get stun, as well as I believe you get light off of the final finisher. If I'm not mistaken, all of them will have the same range and the same cost. They've got good elemental coverage. They've got great debuff coverage off the category itself, coming with a stun, charm, poison, petrification, silence. They also have two kind of higher damage variants as well. It is notable that they've actually got pretty high scaling, 10, 12, over 60% over here with Famax. They don't seem like much on their standard situation, but if something's hit by a breach or if they've got a good elemental advantage, their numbers are going to go wacky real easily. This is going to matter a lot for a lot of ranged weapon type stuff, because they have a hidden multiplier on top of the fact that they've already got higher kind of multiplier bonuses right at the very start here. So just, again, something to consider. Great offhand items here, especially you may notice that some of their stats, if you use them in your primary hand and use your actual primary hitting weapon in your offhand, you'll end up doing a lot better. Like 15 strength bonus is nothing to scoff at. 6 vitality is endgame armor worthy. So yeah, you're going to see a lot of really good bonuses off a lot of these items. Just something to bear in mind. Another tool on your belt there. And actually, I don't have the basic one on here, but it is worth noting that the basic blow dart as well. Actually, I don't even have access to a store in this particular map. The basic blow dart actually has a pretty big luck bonus on there as well. So just something to consider. Actually, most of them do, if I'm not mistaken. No, actually, it's primarily the first ones. But yeah, 15% luck. Or 15 luck, rather, off the stun dart blowgun is nuts. Anywho, let's move on to the next category here, which is going to be bows. Now, these come in two flavors. You've got your long bows and you've got your counter bows. Now, in terms of the whole category, generally we're talking about a cheap upgrade weight. Their actual carry weight is fairly heavy. Their firing rate is not the fastest in the world, but their bonuses are massive. Their hidden bonuses are massive. And if they manage to hit on an enemy that's breached or hit with an elemental advantage, their numbers, once again, go wacky. It's notable that they all have different ranges. So, for example, something like Longbow +1 lasts quite a long time. Siege Bow can last quite a long time after that. And most of your higher-end bows will tend to go up from there. They also contain a lot of very potent bonuses as well. Something like Brimstone, for example, is very capable of ending endgame bosses immediately. But again, it depends entirely on the units that they're used on. We're seeing potentially upwards of 70% bonuses on some of these damages. Plus 50%, plus 30%, plus a minus 15% on the other side. You get the idea of how these things tend to see the big numbers go happy times. That's their main shtick there. However, the lighter weight variants, for example, something like this right here, well, their bonuses are not quite as sexy. They do have a counterattack effect, which does mean that a lot of units like warriors and such can have counterattack on there for their basic weapons, so you can use your old debuff weapons as a way of kind of defensively applying those debuffs now that they're not really the primary mode of attack anymore, while still having access to all of those finishers and stuff like that. It's just a great way to have more options available on your team. However, if you were to just want to be one of those folks that just min-max entirely for, big number, go big fun times, that's when you suddenly, see your range attack bonus fly up to 2,000 plus over here with something like the Jiggler set bonus. However, you can still, for example, apply the Dragon Slayer set from before. For example, if you were to go over here, you grab your Sentinel's Rib, you go and you apply your Dragon Armor up here, and then you were to go stick some Spark Guard boots on that, and there you go. Suddenly you have a Dragoon Archer, which actually, wait a minute, I need to apply the other one right over here. I need to apply some Worm Scale Sleeves, there we go, because the Sentinel's Rib, despite having a Dragon bonus, is one of the only Dragon weapons that actually doesn't give you Dragon Slayer, but either way, you apply something like this, we are now talking about essentially 50% times 2 times 2, plus 50%, plus 30%, plus another 23% over here, plus potentially, whatever the element bonus is, plus another 20% from physical. Long story short, the thing's not surviving is what I'm getting at. This is complete overkill. You really never need this these many bonuses, but I just personally find it very funny how many you can stack up. Anyway, that's kind of the whole shtick with longbows. They have a lot of bonuses. Anything that has breach defenses, well, these things go nuts with them. Due to a lot of elemental shenanigans, one-handed bows tend to function a lot better in the hands of a lot of kind of offhand melee units, like rune fencers or your warriors and stuff like that. For rune fencers, actually having elemental swords in the first hand, offhand element bows are going to give them a lot of, once again, just kind of different answers to different elements while retaining the relic swords spell bonus situation there. Just basically, it's kind of the optimal off-element god, as it were. It gets real stupid, but let's move on. Alrighty, while editing, I actually noticed there's a couple of things that I missed when it comes to archers here. Ignore the cursor going nuts. This is just a thing that happens sometimes. So when it comes to bows, I'll kind of go on about the actual rules in this a little bit, but when it comes to your actual firing arcs, they're actually a bit different than they say on paper. Bows have a unique firing situation here where they're going to entirely depend on the range that you're shooting. So like right here, trying to fire this way, within range, we're not going to make that shot. But if we fire over this way, we're going to be able to make some of these shots over here, despite being slightly higher elevation and things like that. Additionally, units that have a higher elevation may potentially block firing arcs, and additionally, in some cases, you're going to have extra ranges available. So, for example, he can hit this tree over here despite being out of range. He actually could hit these areas over this way. Despite the fact that, again, they're technically outside of his range. Typically, you have about 2 extra tiles of forgiveness outside of your normal firing range before it starts dropping off. And even, like, when it shows an X, that's just roughly where that arrow is going to land. Typically, when going vertical, you have about 1 extra tile. When going flat, or if you're going longer, you're typically going to have 2 extra tiles with an additional tile if firing at a diagonal. And additionally, if you happen to fly up to a far higher elevation, you can potentially go and clear the entire map with your shots. Additionally, I didn't actually cover the finishers. Go figure. Some of the most handy finishers in the game I somehow missed. So So, Dark Weight's going to be your first one. That's just going to be a chance of leaden while being a fairly standard neutral shot. Bear in mind, these finishers are going to function very similarly to melee attacks as compared to your standard bow attacks. So, bow attacks scale high, but they have a hard time when dealing with defenses. I'm not going to get into the exact formulas or anything, but that's basically what you need to consider. That the higher their basic attack value ends up going up, the better they perform. And if you can go and multiply that basic attack value in any way, you know, elemental bonuses, breaches, that kind of thing, you're going to start seeing some of those massive scaling effects a lot sooner. Slumber Shot is going to give you a chance to put a unit to sleep. I believe this was actually kind of stealth buffed over the recent patches, because I remember this being a lot more unreliable, but now it does feel like the PSP version again. Flaming Blast has a chance to charm, as well as being an ice punish, and then finally Imperial Shot is going to be a low chance to stop with a water punish for the final slot here. This is the AI run, so I don't actually have that on this particular file. I just happened to notice it at this time. But yeah, Imperial Shot is going to be very good against water units. The combination of Flaming and Imperial actually ended up accidentally making an AI team of archers win against a Heaven General once. Didn't even mean to send them in there, but just the fact that they get so many different bonuses, the fact that they can abuse those bonuses at long range, did allow them to actually beat one of the harder enemies in the game on total accident with complete generics. It is definitely something that's a pretty handy thing in their tool belt there. It is definitely worth noting that Flaming Blast also, the charm chance on that seems to be pretty darn high. Additionally, I haven't seen any increases in those secondary chances from anything along the lines of stats or buffs or anything along those lines. So I believe those are just going to be a static chance to hit when they hit. Anyway, that's about that for this part. So next up we got crossbows. We're just going to go to Union for that one. Basically just similar to longbows, except they don't have that counterattack thing from before. They've got different versions of a lot of those same bonuses. As always, the dragon lady that likes the dragons apparently also likes to kill the dragons, so all of her water weapons are going to be there attacking said dragons. But either way, most of these bonuses are typically going to be more on the potent side. These typically tend to show up with slightly higher numbers. I believe their caps are fairly similar, but either way, these are more for firing in a straight line. In terms of early game bonuses, I forgot to talk about the bows earlier, but Short Bow +1 comes with that stun effect. Boulder Bow comes with the silencing effect. Cupid Bow comes with a charm effect, and in the hands of archers, obviously all of these are going to be guaranteeable. And then from there you just basically get into your reverse effects, which, as I was mentioning earlier with that anatomy bonus on the bow, something like, anatomy bonus plus the double, plus the other double, plus an instill or something along those lines, plus the averse effect on this for an additional 20%, you get the idea. But then, yeah, as far as the crossbows go, you're typically going to see more of that averse type of situation being applied. Typically, these are going to have access to more elements. In terms of debuffs, you've got Silence coming in off the Boulder crossbow, and then you've got Stun coming off the Damask crossbow. Though not much else beyond that. You don't have any counterattack effect on these things. They're going to be a bit slower to fire than the longbows. But again, they're going to hit a little bit harder in general. In terms of their finishers, you've got your kind of standard, hello, I am a finisher double bind over here. You've got your AoE fire punish with Brimstone Hail, a kind of a bigger neutral punish with Sanctus Flare, and then you've got your crit abuser with Death Whale. Alright, so let's talk Fuseless for a second, because these are going to be the easiest to understand category. These are probably the most basic of the bunch. Basically, as you go up, their attack value goes up. But in this case, it actually matters. With their highest one having, this isn't even fully upgraded. I believe this goes up to like 60% whatever physical scaling, naturally, 180 attack on its face. So these are going to have the highest face attack value as well as the highest physical attack value. And additionally are going to have the slowest reload rate of anything on here. Meaning that your finishers in most cases are going to be your primary mode of attack because, the reload rate is appalling. That being said, all of these are pretty decent. Mirage Strike is good for attacking stuff quickly. It's a pretty standard neutral finisher, and it's going to be way faster than just shooting normally. Rapid Blast is going to do the same thing, but apply Misstep. Neat. It's not even worth the upgrade of 5 recovery time, in my opinion. Tone Minute will allow you to hit Dark, and has a chance to silent. silence. I don't know whether or not this was meant to be a One Vision reference, but I like to think it is. And then Scattershot. This is a delete button. Despite the fact that its element is wind, its element is just death. This is a physical double hitter, 9 range, which is as long as a longbow, which I should have mentioned again for longbows earlier. They actually have ghost range. It's somewhere in the ballpark of about 1 extra range for every 1 extra tile of height that you have, with an additional kind of free tile of range. Actually, it's 2 extra tiles of range just for free, and then an additional one if shooting diagonally. In terms of the guns, though, they just shoot in a straight line. But yeah, Scattershot is just death. It just deletes stuff outright. But yeah, that's about it. That's all there really is to say on Fusils. They're very basic. They don't have anything extra on them except for counterattack on the heavy variants, which usually has a tendency to friendly fire more than anything else. And yeah, that's really kind of about that. That's really kind of the reason that these guys have a tendency to open up with grenades and then go into Scattershot. It's a fantastic combination. They don't really need much more than that. They are basically a gunner after all. So yeah, that's about that. That's all the weapon categories. Hopefully that's helpful in helping you decide how to apply all of these different things. And bear in mind again, with guns, they are a ranged weapon category, so just like all of the other ones, if you're not seeing your crazy numbers happen, breach, elemental bonus, all of that kind of thing, and you'll suddenly see those numbers going wacky. Alright, y'all have yourselves a good one, take care, and thank you for stopping by. Later.